Welcome to Hype Hazard, your source for exposing the tech behind the hype. Today's technology landscape is full of buzz and cash, but it's also full of trash.
And in our show, we'll cut through the flash and ease all of your FOMO, helping you navigate the hazardous data conditions ahead and sidestep all of that marketing wizardry in order to uncover where the real opportunities lie.
If you're a pragmatic innovator, a cautious explorer, or a discerning executive, this podcast is for you. Now, before we jump into today's tech du jour, let's introduce ourselves. I'm Jessica Grootman.
And I'm Jamie Szymanski, and we are technology analysts and founders of Kaleido Insights. We have spent our careers researching new, disruptive technologies and how they impact consumers, businesses, and society at large.
We've seen way too much BS and garbage along the way. But, we've also seen, fair enough, many gems that have totally changed how we live and work. In Hype Hazard, we'll share our experience with you, dear listener, and help you understand all the new, frothy, hyped-up technologies for what they really are.
And spoiler alert, they're typically trash. And with that, let's dive in. So today we're talking about NFTs, or non-fungible tokens, as it stands for. And more specifically, we'll be talking about the world of crypto art. So let's kick this off with defining what an NFT is. And in this definition, I also want to talk a little bit about what NFTs depend on. So let's talk about what they are first. So NFTs, or again, short for non-fungible tokens, they're digital assets. And their identities live on a blockchain. And for our conversation, we'll talk about these assets as pieces of digital art. We're all familiar with digital art in various formats that we've seen online. And the word fungible in other contexts means that it is exchangeable. So currencies, for example, are typically fungibles, meaning that they are identical and interchangeable with one another. So for example, $1 bill or one Bitcoin has the exact same value as another. So it really doesn't matter which one you have. But unlike cryptocurrencies or fungible dollar bills, NFTs cannot be directly exchanged with one another. They're non-fungible. And that's because no two NFTs are identical. So even if an NFT exists on the same platform, in the same game, or in the same collection, they are not the same. Now, what NFTs do in the digital art space in particular is they make digital art tangible. They add provenance and history to digital artwork. NFTs are also indivisible, which means similar to cents to a dollar, how you can break up a dollar bill, you can't split up an NFT or a digital piece of art. They're unique and they are immutable because they are created on the blockchain and tied to a singular object that's recorded on that blockchain. And that's a great segue then into a little bit of a primer on blockchain and smart contracts. Now we could I know, we could do an entire series on blockchain alone. So we're not going to get into a lot of the specifics, but it's important that you understand, listeners, that the blockchain is what verifies and holds a record for you if you own an NFT. The blockchain uses cryptography to make sure that the exchange of this digital good is secure. And a blockchain, in its simplest terms, think of it like a decentralized database or a digital ledger of sorts. And it contains all the transactions on this blockchain network that everyone can see as long as it is a public blockchain. So essentially, think of it like a chain of computers that all have to approve the same block or node or NFT in this case, and the exchange of that asset before it can be verified and recorded. And this is done through a smart contract. You might hear us use that term today too. And simply a smart contract, think of it as a piece of code on this decentralized database or this digital ledger. And what this does, it enforces the terms of the agreement. So it's really important just to remember, technology-wise, that the ownership cannot be reversed immediately or transferred over in the same way a fungible asset can be, because it is on the blockchain and recorded as such. So, in the same way the blockchain is being used as a ledger for other cryptocurrencies and they're public and easy to view, the same thing goes for NFTs. So, it can be very easy to spot any sort of shady digital art deals or forgeries because just like any other artwork, you can see if there are any copies that are being made and who owns an asset and make those determinations for yourself simply by looking at the ledger. I will say as well, before we get into some of the hype, that right now, non-fungible tokens can be purchased on many NFT marketplaces. So things like Rarible, you may have heard of, OpenSea, Engine Marketplace. Since November 2017, $174 million has been spent on NFTs. Of course, that includes other types of NFTs beyond digital art. Different types include everything from real estate to crypto to collectibles. Basically, anything that has tangible value in the real world could have tangible value via an NFT. And Jess, I think that is probably a great setup to talk about the hype. I mean, $174 million. It's pretty insane right now, looking at how much some of these art pieces are selling for.
And growing really exponentially. Now, hopefully, listeners, you're still with us after so much technical lingo. And this is a struggle with blockchain. And so I just want to offer a physical world proxy or analogy for what an NFT is. Think, for example, about a property title, a certificate of authenticity for something. Now, why do we do all the technological hoopla? The real difference here is that it is an immutable record of that. We've always had property titles, we've always had certificates of authenticity, but they're not immutable. They're typically controlled by a centralized source. They often are based on paper. But the technological real breakthrough here is that really twofold. One, it's immutable. It's not going to be deleted. And secondly, related to that, there are copies of this. It's in a decentralized structure. So even if you delete yours or you try, it's going to exist on thousands of other computers. And that's fundamentally both the security paradigm, but also the immutability paradigm. It doesn't matter if you want to try to delete or hack in it. And the way that the cryptography works is chronological. So even if you do, or even if someone tries to forge a different NFT, it has none of that same history or none of that same, like you said, provenance across the entire network. So that's right. Still kind of boring, but a key part of trying to say, okay, well, what's new about these sort of digital property rights?
And we have to lay the foundation with the technology talk prior to getting into the fun stuff as well. So yes, I agree. Thank you for sticking with us. Now let's talk about the hyped up buzz.
And why so much hype for such boring technology? This is a sort of paradox of the crypto space, right? It is incredibly technical, but it is characteristically full of boom and bust, full of craze, full of exponential spikes and then downfalls. By the way, this is the second rise in NFTs, which has paralleled a now over $50,000 value of Bitcoin. So we see these kind of trajectories rising and falling simultaneously. There's also a feedback loop going on here. We kind of talked about this in our first episode around social audio, where you have, these big influencers getting into the space. Obviously, Elon Musk investing in Bitcoin, also getting into NFTs. Grimes sold her art for $6 million. We just heard today that Beeple's art sold for $69 million using an NFT. So that NFT actually sold for $69 million. Mark Cuban, all these, influential cultural and investment figures, but also, and this is one of the big drivers of why NFT now, as in sort of, January, February, March of 2021, we saw one of the oldest art auctions in the world, 255-year-old art auction called Christie's, get into the space. And that was who Beeple sold through initially. And so this has really turned the heads of the rest of the art industry of saying, whoa, what do we need to be paying to crypto
Well, especially because for those of you listening who aren't familiar with Beeple, he typically, he was an artist who did a drawing a day and it started off non-digital and then he turned his artwork digital. And so he sold the collage, a collection of his artwork, and he had never previously sold it. So I think that's an important thing to note here too, is that it allowed who was a famous artist and still is to really make his goods tangible and to receive money for all of his artwork that he's been, completing over the past decade.
Exactly. And this has brought incredible interest and speculation into the space. The cryptocurrency space generally is kind of already ripe with this, but according to L'Atelier BNP Paribas, The value of NFT market has tripled in 2020 and is now, the trading volume is over 400 million in the last 30 days. Expected to grow some 400 billion in the next 4 years. So, take the forecast for what you will, but certainly even looking backwards in the last 30 days, that's an incredible amount of activity for this fairly esoteric, difficult to understand space online. So that's one of the big kind of drivers of the influence, the kind of historical figures getting into the space, a huge splash. These numbers are astronomical. They cause a lot of headlines in and of themselves. But there's also sort of an economic, a cultural, and certainly where we are right now in a pandemic era, we are increasingly consuming, relying on digital media. All of these digital gaming, digital art, digital music, digital tickets, virtual properties, the metaverse, digital sports, all of these areas have grown in and of themselves in the last year because, well, we're online quite a bit more, right? And so that has kind of network growth effects in and of themselves. And so it makes sense that this in our kind of everything, that all of these cultural, commercial, and personal items would gain new ways of leveraging technologies, or leveraging technologies in new ways to extract that value. And in many ways, kind of extending another application of blockchain, which is around this immutable ownership asset. So many are saying that this is kind of an inflection point for blockchain. Now, we've heard that before, so take that with a grain of salt. But we can see a lot of areas in society and economics right now. I mean, this is not unrelated to the GameStop debacle that, took place at the beginning of this year, where we are looking at sort of new modes of thinking, new questions around access and ownership, new questions around the intermediaries that control the existing systems, and the entire kind of decentralized financial DeFi crypto space generally is very interested in these new models. And so perhaps it is an inflection point kind of societally, culturally, that has one manifestation in NFTs today, but we're seeing tremendous hype, just the kind of confluence of these different areas.
I love that you bring up, as you call it, the debacle of sorts of GameStop in the beginning of this year, because I think a lot of people see NFTs, whether you're a buyer or a collector, it's a form of entertainment. It's a form of trading in and of itself. It's a form of investing in an asset that you believe will increase in value over time. I mean, you alluded to the Beeple sale of his artwork that went for $6 million, but that was the resale of it. So originally it didn't sell for that much, but just in a few months' time, it ended up increasing in value. So I think people are seeing this, artists and collectors alike, as just this incredible bubble of a moment in terms of virtual goods because they are finally gaining some more tangibility, we should say. I would also add to your comments on the metaverse. For listeners out there who may not be familiar with that term, metaverses exist in a variety of capacities, basically as either one-to-one comparison or a version of a real world online virtual world. Think Ready Player One, for example, even Minecraft, Roblox, which just went public, also versions of metaverses. And I think that that's important to think about how NFTs will really play and continue to gain traction and value in virtual worlds. Although our conversation today so far has been structured simply around digital art and its connection to the real world in many cases, digital art can live in a metaverse as well as any other NFTs, to your point, a virtual deed. We recently spoke with a company called Upland that allows you to purchase virtual deeds as NFTs as well online. So I think that that's also some of the hype and the boom right now that we're seeing is because metaverses are becoming more popular places to spend time, likely again, because we're spending a lot more time indoors with the pandemic. I'll also say that I think one thing that also makes NFTs really attractive, really hyped up to artists in particular, is that it offers the potential, at least, to get greater profits from their work. So if you can track the provenance of an NFT on blockchain to see who owns it when, what the history of that good is, it would, in theory, allow you to be rewarded royalties every time an NFT, a piece of art, is bought and sold. So that exists already in the real world, and so why shouldn't that exist for digital goods as well? It eliminates those middlemen, too.
This is a key point because in many ways today, the distance between the artist and the fan has been intermediated by many different parties. I mean, the music industry is one example where the scrape off the top, as in many different markets, is often, 10, 20%. But when you have more and more intermediaries, that becomes 50%, that becomes 80%. And so to have this capability where it's not only direct, but there's increasing value thereafter, through what's called a smart contract in other words, if I share with Jamie and then Jamie shares with others, if I'm the original artist, I get a kickback with every share. This is fundamentally new and is a dramatic change from the business models based on intermediation today.
But I think that brings into question, which is probably a good time to talk about exclusivity in general. That's why I keep prefacing all these things with saying, in theory. I've seen way too many, honestly, very sad, and it would be enraging stories if I were the artist right now, of art theft in the NFT world, minting something on the blockchain as an NFT that is not yours.
Right.
And whether that's a piece of digital art, or I've seen instances where it's a tweet or something else that exists, a GIF or GIF, however you like to pronounce it.
Take your pick.
Exactly. So it doesn't really guarantee that you're going to receive any royalties if you are not the person that minted your own artwork as an NFT. And people are tokenizing other people's work, which is one of the biggest hazards I see in this space right now, is that a lot of artists don't necessarily understand the world of NFTs, the technology behind it. So if they don't jump on the train sooner than someone else who wants to mint their work, they're sort of SOL in terms of the exclusivity of the work they created.
It's so true. And we have to point out yet another way in which the technology is light years ahead of the law. Have fun, IP lawyers, on this one.
Oh, God,
a
right.
new frontier.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to talk about, when I thought about what is the biggest hazard, the thing that I roll my eyes at most about NFTs at the moment, can we talk about value or overvalue of some of these things?
I have to ask, what do you have $1 million to spend on, Jamie?
Right. So I think we could probably kick this off with a quote recently that I read an interview with Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz of very famous venture capital investment firm Andreessen Horowitz, whereas Mark said a $200 pair of sneakers is like $5 in plastic. You're buying a feeling. And it's very interesting to apply that to the world of NFTs, that you're buying a feeling here. So value is what you make of it. It reminds me of, and I'm sure you probably can think back to when you first took theory classes as well, Jess, and the theory of value, the subjective theory of value, or STV, which basically says that a good or service, it's not valuable in and of itself, but basically it's how important it is to the consumer. How much are you willing to pay for it? Anybody can say they... Yes, exactly. Someone can say they have a rare collectible that's worth $1,000, but it's only worth that if someone else feels it is worth $1,000. So it frees us from this notion that anything has inherent value. And apply this, subjective theory of value now to the NFT market, and you get into trouble very quickly. I think right now there is a lot of money in a very small pocket in the crypto space, and people are looking for ways to spend it on new technologies and to try to get in on NFTs before anyone else does. So great. It's this bubble that's growing and growing and growing. And that's why we're seeing really just crazy prices in terms of selling and the value of some of these pieces of digital art. But how long do you predict, Jess, it will be before this NFT space is entirely saturated? Like, have you ever gone out on Imgur or DeviantArt? Millions of different art pieces are on there. So what will it matter in the future of value? And will it matter just to, bragging rights at this point? Just to say, well, I own the original. And also, what kind of group are you in that anyone's going to give a shit if you own that anyway? So I think that it's sort of interesting to think about, okay, valuable to whom? There is nothing different about your original copy of a digital piece of art versus any of the hundreds of copies of it online. You have the token that says you have the original, sure, but that does not stop anyone from copying it and sharing it.
So again, this question of accessibility is huge, and especially now because artists, because musicians, because so many of these content creators have been hit, among some of the hardest hit in terms of business models during this time in the pandemic. this question of what kind of value is accessible through an NFT is really huge. And so, we've talked about this kind of through the lens of influence and buzz and how much money is going into this. But there's, I think, another really basic and pragmatic question here around friction. One of the big challenges in the blockchain space is that you have to have wallets. You should probably understand a little bit about blockchain before you go investing in this. There's, Ethereum gas, there's trades, there's smart contracts, there's who knows tax implications. It totally depends. And this level of high friction is also a huge barrier to entry, right? So when we talk about kind of some of the key ways that this space needs to change, I think accessibility has to continue to extend. So.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jess. And I think that some of these last points that we're discussing in the hazardous conditions ahead for NFTs really do seg into, okay, so what needs to change? And you're right. I think that a couple things we haven't addressed yet, though, are with the technology itself. There have been a lot of instances where there have been some pretty disastrous consequences with smart contracts not being up to code, pun intended. So simply that bad code can run a smart contract really effectively useless. I think back to, was it 2015, 2016, that famous Ethereum hack, which, an unknown hacker siphoned off millions of Ether simply by exploiting a loophole. So I think that that's one thing that definitely needs to be addressed. There needs to be a sort of standardized model that is used for creating smart contracts and these unified protocols that are interoperable among various blockchains. I think that needs to be fixed first. Just the very core level of security, sure, maybe the boring stuff compared to some of the more interesting things we've been talking about. But that needs to be absolutely fixed first. And then the second point I would make that we haven't touched on at all, that it might not be in the mind of many consumers or artists out there that are thinking of creating NFTs to represent their works, but it is the environmental impacts.
Exactly.
We haven't talked about that at all yet. And the model of NFTs consumes a lot of energy. In order to create these smart contracts and to mint an NFT on the blockchain and create that secure record has to be done through the same mining process, the similar one that verifies Bitcoin, where this advanced network of computers have to validate the transaction, and it takes the energy sometimes of a small country.
Yeah.
I just saw a post the other day about an artist that put 6 short videos as NFTs of his art sculptures and sold them in a batch. And he'd been paying attention to electricity usage at his studio and the creation in general, and he's an environmental advocate. And he found that simply creating a batch of 6 short, very short videos as NFTs was equivalent to 2 years of energy use at his actual studio.
Unbelievable.
So there has to be a less carbon intensive way to do this. And I know Ethereum's, they're working on it. I mean, doing a proof of stake instead, but it's not here yet. I feel like it's been in the works for years.
It has.
And until this problem has been solved, it's like we are already under a climate crisis. And just simply adding to it to create things that are overvalued and I can't see any real value in a lot of instances anyway seems ludicrous to me.
You're right. In a long-term sense, this is maybe the biggest thing that needs to change, because any kind of longer, more accessible, more lucrative value that is exchanged or enabled, I should say, through NFT relies on this. I mean, focusing kind of deeper into the stack at this environmental cost of running a what's called a proof of work protocol to verify these transactions to make that immutability possible. This has a huge downstream impact on just how much emissions are created as a result of every single one of these. By the way, listeners, if you want to really pull back the cover on this, there's a website called cryptoart.wtf, where it's kind of like a roulette where you can push a button and for every NFT, it tells you the environmental cost of this.
Yeah, it's eye-opening. And that transparency just doesn't exist. I'm glad you shared that. I mean, that transparency doesn't exist at all right now. And especially I know on the creator level. And I'm not talking about creators that are, at the very highest echelon and making millions of dollars. I'm talking about the middle creative class that I would love to really see some dividends from NFTs. They might not even know, a lot of creators, what blockchain is or how it even contributes to creating an NFT or about the mining process and the amount of energy it takes up. So that education needs to be definitely transparent.
One of the interesting things as we kind of look ahead of not just how this needs to change, but what are some of the opportunities here? There are applications, many applications, in fact, using blockchain that are environmentally useful. In fact, there's a project called the Crown Platform, which is aiming to tokenize our carbon footprints and actually create NFTs to finance ecological progress.
Wait a minute.
Yeah. It's called NF Tree, Jamie. NF Tree.
Oh, wow. I feel like that's a little bit ironic, right? I mean, I hope the process to make my carbon footprint to NFT in itself is not creating negative environmental impact.
Ironic is definitely the word for it, but it's also representative of thinking beyond, esports, e-games, skins for my avatar, not to undervalue those things, but, in the grand scheme of societal issues, there are many ways to apply this technology for real gain and for real efficiency, environmentally speaking. There's another project which is called the Pokemon Go for sneakerheads. By the way, sneakers and custom design sneakers have been a subset of the NFT craze. This company is called Aglet, and they are allowing people to collect virtual sneakers by walking instead of driving. So then you can launch your own virtual store with your own virtual sneakers, et cetera, et cetera. So again, we have this upstream technology challenge, but the downstream applications, if we can figure that out, and it's true, Ethereum 2.0 has sort of several rollouts. It's underway. It's still not where it needs to be at all. But if we can figure that out, the downstream application potential for this doesn't just have to be around virtual art. In fact, there's all kinds of very interesting models to incentivize users or consumers or creators to, whatever things that are not just aligned to their financial value, but to their values, right? To what they actually want to promote in the world. So I think that's a huge opportunity. We have to get some more regulatory clarity around this. I think that's a huge barrier, not just for kind of discerning investors and entrepreneurs, but particularly for large corporations.
Great point. We have not even talked about brand engagement and company engagement in this yet. That's
exactly. And that's a big one. The crypto space has been making steps. The SEC has made various steps towards blessing, I could say, these kinds of new asset classes, but it's very not NFTs, and it hasn't caught up. We have a long way to go, but that's a real bridge that we need to cross.
And I think this is one time we'll see a lot of experimentation from the company and brand level in metaverses before real world applications. I think we'll see companies moving faster than regulation, which is typically the case, especially in the tech world that we are familiar with, and starting to experiment with ways to, input their brand, their designs. I see this already in other versions of the metaverse where fashion designers are getting on board with NFTs. It's going to be really fun, I think, to see this unfold, but there obviously are potential consequences down the road too. With that, I think that we probably should give NFTs, as it relates to the art space and perhaps beyond, our rating.
It's
Jess,
time,
I think
Jamie.
it's time. So let me ask, what would you rate NFTs and crypto art?
Well, although I have my critiques of blockchain, I'm actually a long game fan of the technology. So I get really excited about anything that is leveraging this. And NFTs have definitely, regardless of how you feel and emote about them, they have brought a new level of interest and research and development and innovation to the blockchain space. So I get really excited about that. Now, all that said, I'm going to rate this a flash, which is to say it's a flash in the pan. It's really hot now, but I think it's going to be fleeting. And the reason I say that is because this is the tip of the iceberg. NFTs are the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we can actually make immutable. We have seen Bitcoin, a currency application, as the breakthrough application for blockchain. Now we're starting to see a very small subset of ownership as another application of this immutability. What becomes really interesting is when we start to break that out into stakes, into shared ownership, into stores of value, maybe even voting rights, tolls. There's all these downstream applications that this begins to unlock, and smart contracts in and of themselves, that ability to share stake, to pay back the original creator as part of that sort of increasing value construct of ownership. This is really powerful. This creates a kind of new potential social contract between creator and fan, or brand and consumer, as the case may be. So hot now, but I think a flash given the long-term potential.
Sure. I mean, you took it much wider, which is great to hear your perspective on smart contracts at large and how you could see NFTs be, or the concept of NFTs be applied elsewhere. I would say that I would rate NFTs in perspective of this conversation as cash. 100% cash. I put on my brand marketer hat here, Jess, and I thought if I were a brand looking to get into the NFT space, sure, I might pay attention right now to the world of crypto art and some of the other interesting applications that are a little bit easier maybe to sink my teeth into and put my brand name on. But I think that in the future, as the idea of a metaverse or even merging a metaverse with the real world through various, augmented reality and virtual reality applications, I think that we will see this be one of the greatest money-making potentials. I would love to say for creators, but unfortunately, I think it will be cash rating for brands and companies in the long run, far more than for creators in our conversation today and artists. So I think I would rate it cash. Jess rated it flash. And with that, I think that our conversation today is a wrap. This was fun as usual, Jess. I love talking NFTs, and I'm sure we'll probably revisit a lot of these technologies and topics in the future.
More to come.
Exactly. So please, listeners, join us for the next Hype Hazard, where we expose the tech behind the hype. And in the meantime, feel free to check out all of our content at kaleidoinsights.com. We'd also like to thank Randall Ward for our sound editing and Adam Roskowitz, who composed our music and sound effects. Until next time, cheers.
Bye-bye.